Okay, we're on. Hello, everyone. We're here with Rich Rubino, actually becoming our regular political analyst on What's at Risk. It's such a active season, Rich. We're going to
Oh,
have you
indeed,
on once every few weeks here to keep us
indeed,
up to
indeed.
date. Great to have you. I'll just ask you one background question. I know you've been on the show before, but you're such a political junkie. How did you end up being that way? What caused you? What inspired you to be such a focus on political figures in
So
particular?
I fell on my head as a baby, I think. No.
There-
No, I don't. It's a congenital thing. Actually, where I think it precipitated, though, was in part from watching C-SPAN growing up. I remember right around 1986 when it came to Marblehead. I remember watching it. I remember prior to that, though, I do remember being interested for some reason in 1984 when I was 6 years old. I do remember following the presidential election quite vociferously. Where it actually came, it's not that I had some sort of a mentor that was into it that kind of guided me that way. It just kind of happened, and then come home and watch C-SPAN, and then it became just kind of like a monomaniacal interest. And I like specifically the minutia of politics sometimes as opposed to the actual policy. So it's kind of a niche, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you are a savant when it comes to the trivia, so I'm going to start with a trivia question because
Oh,
I know you like this, and
oh,
it's not as heavy as the political situation that we're in the United States today. So only one president was not mourned after his
yep.
death in
John
Washington
Tyler.
D.C. Yeah,
John
how
Tyler.
come? What,
Because
what,
because when he died, he actually in 1862 he got elected to the Confederate Congress. So he didn't actually serve by the time he wasn't able to actually serve because he died beforehand. But because he was seen as a traitor, there was no official mourning in Washington D.C. or around the country of him. He was viewed the same way as someone like Jefferson Davis, for example. So he was the only one that was not actually mourned in Washington.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So Nikki Haley dropped out of the
Yeah,
race
good.
after Super Tuesday, not unexpectedly, frankly. But what impact do you think she had overall on the race, and how will that resonate out?
If anything, what she showed is what the Republican Party is not. Nikki Haley would have been a quintessential candidate in 2008, 2012, when the party nominated candidates like John McCain and Mitt Romney, who had a very much interventionist and hawkish foreign policy. Someone who was a free trader, for example. This time around, she didn't hit any of those dots. That's why Donald Trump is really, whether you like him or don't like him, he's taken over the Republican Party. His ideology is now the main ideology of the Republican Party. That's why anybody like Nikki Haley, who was kind of supported what I would call the status quo ante, which was a Republican main ideology from Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 through Mitt Romney in 2012, is now referred to as a rhino, a Republican in name only. And Trump is really capitalizing that word. It's a word, it really goes back actually to probably around 1992 when a reporter referred to New Hampshire Republicans as rhinos, that they said they were too likely to work with the new president, Bill Clinton. That's where it gone to. But Donald Trump has absolutely monopolized that word. And I think that Nikki Haley represents the fact that it shows the fact that someone like Nikki Haley, or for that matter, somebody like Chris Christie, or for that matter, to a certain degree, Ron DeSantis, are no longer considered major Republican presidential candidates, and Donald Trump now has money over the ideology and over who's going to get elected. In many respects, in some of these down ballot races, because he can just endorse somebody and they get elected, they get
Yeah.
nominated.
But she did do disproportionately well in some metro
Yes,
areas and suburbs too, which like 40% in Atlanta-based Fulton County and DeKalb County for that matter. She got 34% in King County and Seattle. What kind of an implication is that for Donald Trump?
that shows that that's where Donald Trump's weakness is. Donald Trump's weakness is essentially voters who live in urban areas, voters who have college educations. That's where his weakness is. She did very similarly to, I think, the way John McCain performed in both 2008 when he ran and in 2000 when he ran. If you looked at the ballots on states like Michigan, for example, George W. Bush tended to do very well in traditional Republican areas. John McCain did very well in places that have more independents, sometimes more Democrats, and respectively sometimes more voters who will go over from one side to vote in open primary and vote for him. So that's basically what happened. There really is not enough. It's the numerical thing in the primary for somebody with that ideology to win if you have 7 or 8 candidates. Now, if let's say all the candidates agreed at the beginning, we want to defeat Trump somehow. So all candidates just said, we're going to get out and we're all going to support Nikki Haley. I still don't think she would have done well because I still think that Donald Trump's ideology is now people see him as the imprimatur of the Republican Party. They don't see Nikki Haley. They see Nikki Haley as a voice from the past. Nikki Haley is somebody who maybe in 2016 could have potentially been a formidable presidential candidate, but this time around she's seen as too establishment. And this is interesting because Donald Trump has always been was anti-establishment when he ran in 2016. He was the insurrectionist. And now, who would have thought it? But in 2024, Donald Trump is the establishment. If you think about it, in South Carolina, he started the fact that he had every constitutional officer, including Governor Henry McMaster, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Tim Scott, all behind him, endorsing him. He is now that main Republican. Contrary-wise, Nikki Haley had the endorsement of one congressperson in the entire delegation, Ralph Norman, and a few members of the state legislature. So I think she didn't do a very good enough job of that, but she really should have said, I'm now the insurgent. Donald Trump as a support of all the establishment. It's very interesting to think of Donald Trump as an establishment figure, but that's really what he's become.
Yeah. Now we're down to 2 in the election. I mean, we're in the battle for the general election now. Does Joe Biden benefit at all from those voters that wanted Nikki? And are they going to go back to Donald Trump, or could he pick up some of those voters?
The majority, I think, are going to go for Donald Trump. A lot of them were kind of soft Republicans who said, we really want somebody else, but if we have to vote for Donald Trump, I think a lot of them are still going to come home at the end of the day dissatisfied, but they're still going to vote for him. Or for that matter, some of them might go for, I guess, if there's a no labels party candidate, it seems like that would be tailor-made for them because that would probably be somebody who's more internationalist in scope, who's probably more liberal in immigration laws, that type of thing. So there is a possibility. In terms of how many would actually go for Joe Biden, I don't know. They wouldn't do it enthusiastically. If any reason they would do it, they do it because they think he's the best hope because they really despise Donald Trump. And that's certainly contingent within the Republican Party. How many there are of them, we don't know. But I do think that no labels potentially could appeal to somebody in that demographic. Maybe even not that you would actually do it, but if you put up, say, Nikki Haley and Dean Phillips, the Democratic challenge Joe Biden, they could say, we're fed up with the two-party system, something to that effect. You might have some sort of a message that would be met for non-voters or voters who are just disgruntled with both political parties.
Yeah, so any votes for Biden would just be a vote against Trump, basically.
Theoretically, I don't think there are many people that are Haley supporters that say, I really like Nikki Haley. Oh, I like Joe Biden too. I just don't like him as much as I like Nikki Haley. Most of them probably despise Donald Trump, have a lot of enmity toward Joe Biden, but there are some that might think Joe Biden is the lesser of two evils, and those are the people that Joe Biden would benefit from.
Yeah. Something I've noticed over the last just 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month or so, is I see more of Kamala Harris on TV. Is that a planned thing? Is that a purposeful thing? I'm imagining it is. What is your speculation on that?
Oh, I think so too, and you're absolutely right about that. I think part of it, they want to sully all those who are saying that Kamala Harris should not be vice president, Joe Biden should pick somebody else, or that if Joe Biden gets elected, Kamala Harris is going to become president. Kamala Harris can't do anything. She can't tie her shoelaces, everything is. They want to show, first of all, that she is a formidable person, whether you like her or not ideologically, that she actually is functioning. She knows the world leaders. She knows what's happening in the country. So they're trying to show that. But I also think they want her to actually become an asset. They figured there's a lot that she has going for her, being certainly the fact that she was somebody who, certainly the fact that she's the first female and the first person of color to become vice president. I think that's something that certainly benefited Joe Biden in the primary. So theoretically, that's the one demographic. If you look at Hispanics and African Americans, where Joe Biden is seeing a big drop this time, they want to have her go out and say it's okay, you should still vote for this person. So I think that's part of the strategy. But the last thing they want is the convention this summer is for there to be a big Stop Kamala movement. They want him to say this is a unified ticket. They say Joe Biden won almost overwhelmingly in the primaries. Kamala Harris is very popular, and we're going to essentially have a unified ticket, and almost every Democrat is going to be for this ticket.
At the convention, there's probably no chance of an outside candidate coming in and stealing the nomination, right?
I love the question, though. You think of all
give some guesses.
You think of all the machinations of how this could happen. Theoretically, the answer is yes. Legally, the answer is yes. In 1968, Eugene McCarthy was participating in primaries and winning them. Hubert Humphrey didn't participate in a single primary. Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. So he came to the convention, and Hubert Humphrey ended up becoming the nominee because, in part, he got a lot of delegates, and he went to the delegates who weren't necessarily who were kind of could go either way. And he went to them and he said, will you support my campaign? So Hubert Humphrey becomes the nominee. Then there are riots in Grant Park all over. And consequently, you see a divided Democratic Party. And at the end of the day, Hubert Humphrey barely wins the nomination. And then he loses the presidential race. So that's the worst case scenario. And if anybody were to do that, by the way, especially if that person loses, that person would be persona non grata in the party for pretty much until kingdom come. Can you imagine somebody getting up there, so any governor, senator, or congressman getting up there and giving a speech and say, I don't want the person who's the party is so unified with. I don't want that person. I want to get this person instead. By the way, there has been, I remember in 1972, actually, George McGovern, this is very similar. George McGovern, a lot of Democrats were really kind of caught off guard that he was going to be the party's nominee. Apparently, he worked very hard in Iowa, came in third place, did very well in New Hampshire. Later on, there was a Stop McGovern movement at the convention because they thought McGovern is a sure loser to Richard Nixon because of his ardent opposition to the United States' support of the Vietnam War. So Jimmy Carter, a first-term governor of Georgia, at the time you can only serve one consecutive term, gets up there and actually nominates the moderate to conservative Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington. It never went anywhere, but it actually benefited Jimmy Carter because lots in the Democratic Party were saying, yeah, this is what we need. We don't need George McGovern. We need somebody who's a Southern centrist who teaches Sunday school to inoculate ourselves from the criticism that we're all wild-eyed hippie liberals. So that's the time it did work. But I think if anyone did it this time around, especially if that candidate were to lose in the general election, a lot of people would blame the person who did that. But it's fun to talk about.
It is fun to talk about. Any guesses of who might come in from the outside and try that?
I could see. I can't see anybody from the outside really coming in and doing that. I think they're going to have such a controlled convention. That being said, if Joe Biden on the other side of this, let's say there's a health scare with Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. Let's say it would happen to any candidate, or there's something to that effect. I don't think the Democrats are going to give Kamala Harris a free ride. There'll be other people that will run. The ones that I think in terms of most electable, I would say, is Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina, because he's been elected twice in one of the most quintessential swing states in the country, the state that Joe Biden actually lost by the least amount last time around, about 1.6% of the vote. And he's somebody who's been elected Attorney General. He's been elected governor of that state. He has a Southern accent. And generally speaking, it's very hard for Republicans to allocate Southern governors as these kind of far-right, San Francisco liberals. And that's how Jimmy Carter got elected. That's how Bill Clinton got elected. Bush and Ford, respectively, could not make that case. So he'd be one I would look at. I would look at Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey. I think he's probably the most charismatic voice in the Democratic Party. The problem is, last time when he ran, he was always getting, if you go to any events in New Hampshire, all the other candidates got up there and spoke, and sometimes it was kind of polite applause. When he gets up there, he gets thunderous applause. Now, these are probably from people who are not voting for him, but that would be one person that I would certainly think would probably be a considerable candidate. That would be Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, who just got reelected in a very important swing state. So there'll be plenty of other people who are not even talking. Mitch Landrieu, the former governor of New Orleans, would be one that I would think potentially would consider it. And then you get a bunch of then you probably get a scenario of about 50 people who are very minor candidates in the Democratic field. They're going to say, this is my chance to alley-oop, this is my Hail Mary, and I'm probably going to get involved in it too. But my guess is even though it's a great intellectual exercise, my guess is the nominees of the Democratic Party will still be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. It's very hard to envisage a scenario where it will not be.
Yeah. I mean, Booker's the only one of those ones that you mentioned that, frankly, I recognize his name. So
George Kelly, the governor of Kansas, would be another one, and Andrew Fletcher. I'm sorry, and Andrew Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, other governors who have been able to get elected in red states.
Got it. So Joe, gave a fiery State of the Union speech, and that was purposeful for sure, just to be energetic and to get out there and be very affirmative on all the issues. He didn't get much of a bump from it though in the polls. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it shows in part how politicized this country is right now. Yeah. When Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, and this wasn't that long ago, would give a speech, they would see sometimes 10, 15 points bump in the polls after giving that one speech, because these are the people that are probably not very interested in politics, very depoliticized, probably do go out and vote every 4 years, but it's not really the main part of their lives. But you know what's happening? Their favorite television program on Tuesday night is not on, and they go to all these other channels, and so all of a sudden they say, oh, all right, maybe I'll watch this, and they have a positive view of that afterward. This time around, it's very hard to see people, even people people that you would never think would be interested in politics have an interest in politics. A lot of them may be quiet about it because they don't want to offend their bosses. They don't want to offend people around them.
Mm-hmm.
But for that matter, but I do think that there are plenty of people who do have an interest in politics. And if, in fact, if you have a scenario where last time around, 94% of Democrats voted for Biden, 9% of Republicans voted for Trump, that shows that we're just so kind of at this homeostasis ideologically, if you will. And there are very few voters who will actually go from one to another, or they're very lukewarm about either candidate today.
Got it. Now, Schumer just came out the last couple of days and said Netanyahu should resign and move on and open the job up to others in Israel. Was that also choreographed, or is that just floating out a concept without having Joe Biden say it? Why did that all of a sudden? That seemed like it came out from out of the left field.
Oh, I think it was choreographed. I think the Democrats are feeling the heat. In part, in Michigan, there were thousands of voters that voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary, where there was really no other candidate on the ballot other than Joe Biden. Michigan is extremely crucial for them to win. They barely won it last time, but there are places, Dearborn, Michigan, for example, per capita has the largest Muslim population, and the Muslim community is absolutely inflamed by that Joe Biden has continued to support funding Netanyahu, funding Israel. So he's continued to do this throughout this. Some of them call him Genocide Joe. There's a whole movement. There's some of the protesters that were saying abandon Biden. That is extremely dangerous. It's hard to see a scenario where Biden somehow wins without winning the state of Michigan. So they need to do that. But on the other side of that, Biden cannot completely restate his position, because then he could potentially lose some generally Democratic type Jewish voters on the one day. So it's very much it's very much going back and forth on that. In terms of, I think Schumer was trying to tell the base of the Democratic Party that both him and Joe Biden, who both have had their entire career, have been extremely sympathetic to Israel's interests. Joe Biden is actually on tape calling himself a Zionist, for example. He's actually on tape when he was in the Senate. And Chuck Schumer was one of the people, for example, when the Iran nuclear deal came up, one of the few Democrats that actually voted against it. But he's trying to say that we hear you. We're not necessarily going to be one-sided on this and only support what Israel does. We're going to be more balanced. We hear what you're saying. And the other thing that he needs to do, which I think the Democratic Party needs to be successful at, is differentiating Bibi Netanyahu and his Likud party from Israel. Bibi Netanyahu is not particularly popular in the country of Israel. People think that, there are some in America, for example, that think that it's equivalent of supporting Netanyahu as supporting Israel. But there have been people protesting, hundreds of thousands of people protesting his try to put an iron grip, for example, on the judiciary. And he's a very conservative person also. And you hear Bernie Sanders say that essentially he says it's not anti-Semitic to go after a right-wing government. So they want to differentiate being anti-Israel. No one's going to be anti-Israel, but we think there's a better leader potentially in the country of Israel. That would be someone who would be willing to work like Ehud Barak did, for example, in Camp David in 2000, when him and Bill Clinton came up with this deal. The Yasser Arafat ultimately objected, but potentially he gave a lot more than Netanyahu would give. And frankly, Netanyahu was somebody who was actually opposed to the idea of a binational state. He said he would not support a two-state solution. And I think that Schumer and Biden are trying to kind of get in the center of this. I don't think Biden really expected there'll be as much turmoil on this as it was. He reminds me a little bit of Lyndon Johnson. His first two years in office, civil rights, Medicare, Medicaid, Rat Extermination Act, war on poverty. Second 2 years were enveloped by Vietnam. And the same people supporting him the first 2 years were opposed from the second years. He doesn't want the same scenario where people who support him his first 2 years who say he has a great domestic program, supported the Inflation Reduction Act, but now say he's now persona non grata because of his support for Netanyahu. If I were him, I could make the comparison. I would say something to the effect of supporting Netanyahu in Israel not supporting Netanyahu would be like somebody in Israel would be like someone in America not supporting Trump or not supporting Joe Biden. It doesn't mean that they still are, that their interests aren't America's interests. It means they don't think that's the person that should be leading them.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good analogy with Vietnam, because I think the American public, and I remember it, you're watching the TV every night, you're seeing the number of American soldiers killed, you're seeing the body bags. It was horrible. It's hard to watch. And Gaza is equally hard, maybe even harder, because of the kids and the families whose lives are being destroyed there. It's really it's a tough situation. But a very tricky political problem, no question, for the Democrats, in particular Biden. So
yeah, and I do think that it's the same scenario where It's the same scenario. I think you have a lot of older Democrats, particularly you have a lot of older Democrats, kind of establishment Democrats that will say Harry Truman was the first president to recognize Israel in 48. We're going to stand with him. So they're very much pro-Israel, and they would never leave the party. But on the other hand, you have a lot of young voters who are looking what's happening in Gaza and saying there needs to be a ceasefire here, just like in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson had a lot of support of kind of older establishment Democrats. But a lot of younger Democrats were the ones that became very anti-LBJ, and that was why Eugene McCarthy almost beat him in the New Hampshire primary, because it was this one issue of Vietnam. The older voters were saying, yeah, but we're liberal on a lot of things. We support Lyndon Johnson, but we really need to take on communism. The younger people were saying this is not a geopolitical conflict for the whole country. This is a civil war between the North and the South. Today, you're seeing a lot of that same scenario, and younger people are saying that there needs to be a ceasefire, and you're right, just like you would see in 1967. It did not work well for Lyndon Johnson when every time you turn on the news, you saw casualties, and he would say something to the effect of, the victory is around the corner. And in Joe Biden's case, if you see this every day, eventually there's going to be a lot of people who maybe supported Israel at the beginning, who are starting to now question this and say there has to be a way to get out of here.
Yeah, no question about that. So I asked you this question the last time we talked a few months ago, but all the major factors that are either politically charged or just societal type factors like abortion rights, climate, Social Security, Medicare, democracy after the attack on the Capitol, foreign policy, and Gaza. And the economy. It's the economy.
That's always one of those small issues you never think about.
It's always the economy, stupid, right? So have those changed over the last couple of months, or are we still, as a country, now that we're going to have this prolonged, political battle here till the election actually happens several months from now? What are the things that are on people's minds? What's gonna motivate them to vote one way or another?
Yes, absolutely. And let's take Joe Biden off the table and pretend, just say this is candidate A, any milquetoast Democrat. First of all, here's what his advantages are for re-election. He did not have a major primary challenger. Gerald Ford had Ronald Reagan in 1976, landed up, they divided the party. Ford lost to Carter. 1980, Jimmy Carter had challenges from Jerry Brown and Ted Kennedy, divided party. He lost the election. 1992, remember George H.W. Bush, Pat Buchanan challenged him. Bush lost the election. Contrary-wise, Barack Obama in 2012, George W. Bush in 2004, Bill Clinton in 1996, Ronald Reagan in 1984, Richard Nixon in 1972, Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956, keep going, all had minor challenges for the primaries, in their own primaries against them, meaning they had a unified party. So he has that to his advantage. The other thing he does have to his advantage, even though Americans aren't necessarily feeling it, is the economy is accelerating and inflation is not as bad as it was a year or two ago. The problem with the Biden administration is trying to send that message, and Biden has not been a very good messenger. He spends a lot of time in swing states, but it does not show up in the polls that people are starting to feel good about the economy. It reminds me a little bit of George H.W. Bush in 1992. The economy was improving, but people weren't feeling it. The macro numbers, some they'll say, oh, those are macro numbers, so you can read in the Wall Street Journal, but at the micro level, people were not feeling it. And George H.W. Bush was not very good at trying to convince the American people that the country was in propitious economic times. So, but I would say those two factors, and the factor that, at least as of now, there's no United States ground troops in a military conflict. Those three scenarios together should give Joe Biden about a 5 or 6 point lead now. And if they continue going in this way, he should be able to win by about 11 or 12 points. Well, so why is he not doing that? Partly because the age issue is always one of the issues, and there are a lot of Democrats who say are just pleading for somebody else to be the nominee. If you ask me, the majority of Democrats even think that Joe Biden is too old to be president. They think that there should be somebody else as the nominee. That's really hurting him in many respects. I think sometimes his kerfuffle, sometimes his malapropisms, or whenever people film it, and then it goes on YouTube, and millions of people are seeing it. They're saying, how can this person possibly be president? That's something that's working against him. Certainly, the issue of Gaza is another thing that's working against him, because there's such division within the political party. There's really nowhere for him to go for there to be a victory there. But I think that what's going on in Michigan specifically should really be send alarm bells to the Biden administration, because there's really no way maybe if he wins North Carolina, we can somehow envision it, but it's really hard to win without winning the state of Michigan. I know that there are a lot of Democratic officials nationally that are going to Michigan. They're trying to meet with state party officials and to try to get them to somewhat at least lukewarm support Joe Biden. But so that's kind of where the scenario is right now. But in terms of issues that people are interested in, obviously the economy is first. You do have the democracy issue that very rarely gets up to the top. You have the issue of immigration, how Joe Biden is going to handle that. And that's kind of an issue that seems to be benefiting the Republicans right now. The Republicans can go to the border. They can say these many migrants have come in. That's really benefiting them. The one thing that I think Donald Trump knows that's benefiting Joe Biden, he's trying to figure a way to get out of this, is the abortion issue. Because governors like Christine Noem in South Dakota, or Doug Burgum in North Dakota signed laws that basically disallowed abortion after 6 weeks. And a lot of Americans, even Americans that are kind of quasi anti-abortion, look at that and say that's gone too far. So Donald Trump supposedly is looking at his vice presidential running mates, the potential ones, and he does not want one that has what he would see a radical position. He knows that this is an issue they're very vulnerable on. He saw last time around the 22 midterm elections that there was not a red wave that came from it. He thinks part of it is because of that. I think you're going to see a scenario for Donald Trump taking a lot more moderate views on the issue of abortion than I think a lot of other Republicans who ran in the primary. So you wonder someone like Tim Scott, who said he supports a 6-week ban, would that limit him from being on the Republican ticket? I would say probably yes, but I'd say he also would probably be limited because he voted to certify the election and because he's more of an interventionist on foreign policy. But it's certainly Trump knows that, and he knows one thing he knows for business, and he knows politics from a purely calculated perspective, and he knows that this is an issue where there's a lot of vulnerabilities for the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's a great overview. So I'll ask you one last question. In your sweet spot, historical reference, is there historical precedence for what we're going to go through here over the next 6 months in this election cycle, which will be long and ugly, likely? Is there historical precedence for that?
A little bit. There's historical precedence in the respect, and I think this is more true with 2016, but I think you could say it this way at time as well. In 1896, Grover Cleveland was a Democrat. He was president of the United States, became extremely unpopular. There was a Great Depression. Cleveland believed that the president should be a guardian president and that he really had nothing to do with stimulating the economy. So there were basically protests around the country. The Democratic National Convention nominates William Jennings Bryan, a 36-year-old former 2-term congressman from Nebraska, and become his nominee. He has completely different ideology than most of the Democrats. He wants more efficient government spending. He's against the gold standard. He wants protective tariffs. He ends up winning the nomination of the Democratic Party. What happened? A lot of traditional Democrats went over and voted Republican for Mr. McKinley on the other side, just like what's happening now potentially with some of the Nikki Haley folks, and Grover Cleveland himself kind of gradually supported a third-party candidate in John M. Palmer. That's one scenario that's somewhat similar. The other would probably be in the 1920s, because in the 1920s was the last time you had a Donald Trump-like Republican. Listen to anything Warren G. Harding or Calvin Coolidge says, and it will be very similar to Donald Trump, just without the bombastic nature of it. But they both wanted they wanted protective tariffs, they wanted great restrictions on legal and illegal immigration, and they at least rhetorically wanted a non-interventionist foreign policy. And in both cases, Harding wins in 1920, Cleveland wins in 1924, but there are certainly some similarities. The differences are that Harding and Calvin Coolidge were not nearly as divisive figures as Donald Trump is. In fact, Coolidge was pretty popular even with people who didn't like him because he was somebody who had kind of a very mellow type of a personality. He'd like to make jokes. The best joke was when in Massachusetts, Channing Cox, who succeeded him as governor of Massachusetts when Coolidge became vice president, Coolidge came to his office, and Channing said, Calvin, I don't get this. When you were governor, you would be out of here by 4, maybe 5 o'clock at night. I'm here, people to 8, 10, 9 o'clock at 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. He said, people just keep talking to me. To which Coolidge responds, you talk back.
That's a perfect way to cap the show. Rich Rubino, we've been talking to, who's our favorite political analyst and definitely a savant when it comes to the history of politics in the United States. Rich, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Look forward to doing it again sometime.
All right. Sounds good.